Welcome to Today in Space. We're here for another episode of the podcast, and we're going to talk about Starship's fourth flight test, IFT4. It happened on June 6th in a very busy and productive week in space. There are so many things to talk about. We're just going to take an episode to break down each launch and go from there. So buckle up, get ready for it, and let's talk about Starship's IFT4 launch. And reentry, baby! Let's go! All right, folks, thank you for being here. Let's start off with a quick recap on what Starship is. Starship is SpaceX's option to making life interplanetary. It's a really mind-blowing thing when you think about it. It's bigger than the Saturn V, has more thrust than any rocket we've ever had, never mind with human beings on it. It's made of stainless steel and not the classic titanium or aluminum or carbon fiber. And it also has 33 Raptor engines just on that super heavy booster on the bottom. The Starship itself kind of looks like a squid. I think we've got a rocket pen here. Yeah. So here is what Starship in all of its glory looks like. This is our 3D printed rocket pen that you can pick up in our Etsy store, ag3dprinting.etsy.com. But back to Starship. This is revolutionary in that it can bring up to 100 people at one time. And right now, with some ingenuity, we could have 7 people come back on a spacecraft that's going to the space station. But to go from the moon, from Earth to moon, or to Mars, we don't really have a spacecraft that can do that. Never mind a spacecraft that can both fly and orbit and carry crew, but then land in the same spacecraft. And that is the revolutionary thing that SpaceX's Starship might be able to give us if they're able to continue to succeed and get further. SpaceX's Starship is also one of the first human landing system that NASA will utilize to land the first astronauts for Artemis 3 on the surface of the moon. Artemis 2 is coming up right now, slated for next year, and those will be the first humans to orbit the moon since the Apollo era. But basically, Starship is a big factor in how far we go in the solar system for humanity. And the idea is, if we have a spaceship that can go from place to place, it kind of serves as a mini colony, a mini outpost that you can fly, land, make fuel, go back up into orbit, and come back home. The hardest part is getting off of Earth and then refueling the Starship in orbit. But this flight test, IFT4, is a big milestone, and we'll explain why. But basically, this was the first time that we were able to see the full flight test completed. So let's break it down. So SpaceX has figured out how to manage all of those engines that are on board Starship's Super Heavy booster. And, those 33 Raptor engines produce so much thrust. I mean, I've seen a good amount of rocket launches in my day, but I don't think I've ever seen the plume coming out of the flame trench of a rocket be affected with sonic booms from the force generated by the rocket itself. It truly is massive, and that is not an understatement. And at launch, fully fueled on the launch pad, it weighs 5,000 pounds, the full thing, constructed Starship and Super Heavy booster. And what they were able to do in this demo was prove that they do actually indeed have the ability to have controlled re-entry of this entire rocket system. So reusability is not something that had been accomplished or achieved by the industry. Not that they didn't want to, but that it just seemed to the entire industry as something not worth pursuing, or the risk financially, never mind to any kind of human life, sending anybody on board, was massive. And we had just come off of an era where we retired the space shuttle, which was the first reusable spacecraft, and it was expensive and it took too long. And so it took risk takers and people who were passionate about progressing the technology behind sending humans into space, like SpaceX and Elon Musk and Gwynne Shotwell and a whole slew of people that there's so many people to mention, not only that started at SpaceX, but that also helped give SpaceX an opportunity in the early days of the Commercial Crew Program for Dragon spacecraft so that they could grow enough and have enough business to then eventually fund the Starship development. Because unlike, say, a NASA program like the Orion spacecraft that's being funded by the taxpayers, SpaceX originally was putting up front all the money to develop Starship on their own. And a lot of that is being paid for by the Starlink satellites that they have up there, and they're constantly launching. And Starlink played a huge role in this flight test as well as the others, because it's able to stream data and HD video from this rocket as it flies, and even more importantly, showed us incredible views of the reentry. And that's where we want to talk to next. So about 2 days after the flight, SpaceX released this insane footage from a camera. I think it was a camera on the water on next to a buoy that was placed perfectly to see that skyscraper of a rocket, reignite those engines, and then have full control over the thrust of that rocket to control this massive thing into a very slight touchdown on the water, where it basically went vertical and just slowly tipped over. They actually might fulfill what Elon Musk said early in the days of Starship flight tests, that by the 5th flight test they would attempt this on the tower, and they figured out the physics and the science, and now they're actually going to try it back on that launch pad, where the launch pad has these 2 arms. They've called them the chopsticks in the past, but basically that booster would come back in, try the reentry burn, and then those flaps would basically be held by the chopsticks, and then the rocket would just be right there on the pad where they could refuel it, fix it, analyze it, and get it ready for the next launch. So that's going to be crazy, but that's for the next flight test. Let's talk more about what they did in this 4th flight test. And again, we talked about controlled reentry of Super Heavy booster, but more importantly, of the Starship itself. Now, the Starship is, the first stage booster. Obviously, it's expensive. It would take a lot of time to manufacture, so you don't want to lose these. But losing a booster, as opposed to losing the spacecraft that's going to carry humans, is a very different thing. And so I was looking very keenly at what Starship would be able to do as it re-entered the atmosphere. We saw the last flight where they had some issues in controlling their attitude, and so basically the Starship kind of out of control tumbled through the atmosphere. But we saw some insane views of the re-entry and the plasma buildup of the max aerodynamic pressure as Starship is plowing through more and more atmosphere and more particles, and those are getting pushed away by Starship, building up this plasma and this heat. Starship had to be able to control itself going through that. These reusable tiles that they're building had to be able to survive. I mean, we're seeing a few of them fall off. They haven't figured it out fully, but there's no humans on board, so keep getting data is the idea, and we're all about that on the podcast. It also had to be able to use those flaps at hypersonic speeds to be able to control Starship as it came back in, to turn Starship around, and then allow those boosters to shed the rest of the speed so that it could touch down safely in the ocean. And they did that. They experienced peak heating. The spacecraft was able to survive and then still perform the maneuver at the end to touch down. It experienced max aerodynamic pressure and made it through. The spacecraft did not fall apart. It shed the speed, and the flaps even though the flaps, like the Terminator, getting obliterated and the heat concentrating at that flap connection, something the SpaceX team was aware of, but figured, we're going to change it in the future. Let's put a camera looking right at the area that we think there's going to be a problem, and we're going to get a ton of data and visual confirmation of, is this design not ideal? And even with all of that they thought they were going to experience, even though the flap looked like it had burned through it entirely, like it couldn't work, it still came through. It still helped make the maneuver to flip Starship over for landing. And I mean, that thing got mangled and it still survived. So to me, as someone who I've been following space for, the industry for about 14 years now, 10 for this podcast. I went to school for aerospace engineering. I have my aerospace engineering degree, so I've learned the science and the mathematics and the chemistry and all the stuff that goes behind this. Given all of that, I am blown away by what SpaceX was able to accomplish in their 4th flight test. And the progress that they make from test to test is really, really incredible. And, my biggest concern with Starship has been very much like the shuttle. There is no jettison. There is no abort. There is no, if there's something wrong with Starship, that's their spacecraft. That's what they're coming home in. And, the space shuttle experienced issues where, when the foam was impacted, we lost lives. And reentry is nothing to play with. But today, seeing that Starship can, of its own accord, control itself and re-enter, even experiencing extreme heating, gives me so much hope for what's to come. There's a ton of work to be done. Don't get me wrong. It's not like I would put human beings on there tomorrow, but showing that they have this much control this early, and the fact that they're going to continue to launch and test the rest of this year. I mean, we're 2 tests in here in 2024. That's 50% of all the tests that they've done so far with a full Starship. I think they're going to triple that amount here. So I think we could see as many as 6 tests this year if everything goes great and if manufacturing continues. I mean, they have a handful of Starship at Starbase right now. Really, I think the biggest hurdles will be how fast can the FAA turn around certificates of licensure. Obviously, we don't want them to rush and, if something needs to be looked at, look at it. But if that goes well, they seem to be building a good relationship with the FAA. They didn't get any kind of ding on the last flight test, and they succeeded in everything the FAA was looking for. So there won't be a mishap investigation. I do think there's going to be a lot of time spent in what's the difference between landing this super heavy booster in the ocean versus landing it back in Boca Chica on land with that launch pad. I mean, it's it's dangerous, but it's going to be, entertainment will be guaranteed, just like this last one. And we're also going to see some design changes moving forward. SpaceX is going to want to adjust that design for that flap like they talked about. Basically, these forward flaps here will be shifted leeward. And so basically, the idea there is that by maneuvering them a little bit, you're going to have higher reliability for the spacecraft, so you won't have that concentration of heat. You'll have more ease of manufacturing for them, which will be huge, because if we're going to launch a lot of these, they have to be able to consistently make them quickly. And then the ease of payload to orbit. They've got a lot of work to do, but I am always and continually impressed by what the SpaceX team is able to accomplish, and all those people that have hung out so long and been a part of that team. There's so many veteran members, veteran as in they've been there a long time, longer than 4 or 5 years. And the fact that this team is still so mostly together and they are just pushing the bounds of what's possible in space travel. And, here we talk often about, building a fantastic future for all of us, and that's what this feels like. This feels like something sci-fi-esque, something to be hopeful for and excited about in the future. And to me, that's what Starship holds. But we want to know what you think. What did you think about this fourth flight test of Starship? Did you have a blast? Was there anything you were still confused by? Do you have any questions? And what are you most looking forward to on the next test flight? I know we're going to be excited to see more and more views of Starship re-entering the atmosphere and seeing just how much farther they can get on IFT4. Again, Elon's talking about landing the booster back on the launch pad, so we'll have to see how that turns out. This not only helps SpaceX, but it helps NASA. It gets us closer, one step closer, towards landing the Artemis astronauts on the moon for Artemis 3, and it's just going to help everyone figure out more about what's the rubber meeting the road for Starship, and how are the ways that they'll be able to design around this. And we've also got the Polaris Dawn mission, which at some point after their Crew Dragon missions, testing spacesuits out on spacewalks, going further than humans have been outside of Earth. Like, there's so much to be excited for. Man, the ability to send 100 people to the moon or Mars is just wild. So, lots of work to do, but big thanks to everyone who's involved in this, and everyone even in the background who was fighting for SpaceX to have this opportunity to innovate and try new things and go for it. I mean, we are all go. If having a private company like this allows us to sustain through presidential administrations and not suffer the fate like we've had so many times with the space program since the space race, where political whims and changing of offices has caused space programs to die or be created in ways that are just not sustainable and then eventually get canceled. I think there is a lot to be grateful for having this mix of private space, and a big thank you to everyone who's fought for that, for us to have that stability and durability for the space program so that we don't end up in a place like we were 14 years ago, back in 2010, 2011, where we weren't sure if the space program, human space program, was going to survive. So this is a big day. There's a lot to come. Folks, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. Spread love and spread science. Have a good one.